Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lorena Silos from the University of Alcalá, and I would like to welcome you all to this fourth session of the Spotlight on Education series. First of all, let me thank you all of those people who have made this series possible, particularly colleagues working in the work package too. Sarah Westman from Lund University, Ana Gigosos and Juan Jesus Garcia from the University of Alcalá, and always behind the scenes and making it all possible technically, Isabel Nilsson, also from Lund University. The title of our session today is Unexpected Outcomes of Internalization, and I have the enormous pleasure of presenting two experts in the field, Professor Anna Halbach from the University of Alcalá and Professor Garo Harwood from Lund University. I will give Anna Halbach the floor first, but let me just shortly introduce her. Anna is full professor at the Department of Modern Languages of the University of Alcalá. She has been working on the methodologies of English language teaching, and her current research focuses on bilingual teaching and on literacy development as an essential element of English language teaching. She has even developed a new approach on English language teaching called the literacy approach. So Anna, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Lorena, for this kind introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm very sorry about my voice. I have a very bad cold, but I hope I don't start coughing, and as long as I don't do that, I'll be okay. I'm going to share my screen with you, and here we go. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is some unexpected outcomes for internationalization. This was the topic we decided on when we first met, Garo and myself. And the first question that we need to ask is maybe, why do we let me just check. Yeah. Why do universities want to become international in the first place? Well, probably because of the prestige that it gives to universities when they become known in other countries. And this is, of course, important for rankings and the like, which is, again, important for universities as such. One of my sons, my youngest son, decided that he was going to study in Munich because that was the best university. So students of future students do look at rankings to take their decisions. We also want to become international because it allows us to do research collaborations with people from other institutions, and this is of course enriching. There's also a financial aspect to it because incoming students will pay money, especially if they come from outside Europe. And also there's a cultural experience, which is something that Garo is going to focus on, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore. However, when internationalization affects lectures, this may be, or there is another side to it. First of all, when we have international students, when we do programs for international students, we normally have to teach in a language that is not our own. Especially in countries like Spain, where the English language level is not that high. Maybe Sweden is different, and other countries have a different experience of this. But for our teachers, often this means that they feel put on the spot. They don't have the necessary language skill, or they have a necessary language skill, but it is still not your own mother tongue, and this makes it more difficult to communicate. And also, it makes it much more difficult to be spontaneous. So basically what teachers do, what lecturers do, is they have to think much more about their lessons, their teaching, how to organize it, how to deliver, they prepare the language, and so on. And this may mean more careful preparation of teaching, because I have to think more about it. I have to devote more time to preparation. This might mean that my teaching actually becomes better. And I also, as a lecturer, identify more with students. My students will probably also not be mother tongue speakers, English mother tongue speakers. And so we can identify with them as language learners. This is something that happens, and that I have been told by lectures that happens, and it leads, the careful preparation and the greater identification with students leads to greater learner-centeredness. And once we are centering on the learner, once we are thinking more about the learner, the whole thing gets moving. Because teaching is more learner-centered, students will, lecturers will think about students' difficulties. They will try to identify beforehand what students will struggle with because they are learning in a language that is not their own. So they are going to think in terms of content and skills, and probably they're going to think about how they can help students understand and develop the necessary skills. So the perspective suddenly becomes much more learner-centered, where before maybe the lecturer was thinking more about, okay, this is the content I'm going to teach, or this is the skill I want to develop, and this is how I think I'm going to best develop the skill or best deliver the content. Now the perspective has changed, and although this change may be very slight to start with, or looked at from the outside, it actually makes a lot of a difference. So we end up with potentially better teaching, as we said before. And there's a second aspect, and this aspect is the one that I'm particularly interested in, because the teaching, as we said, is more learner-centered. The question is, what difficulties will my students face? But there's also the language. So the lecturer will also probably think about the language that they will use so that students can understand them, but also possibly the language that the students will need to communicate, because speaking about what you're understanding, working on it with fellow students, and so on, will allow students to develop their understanding, to develop their learning, basically. And when lectures, when lectures think about this, often they will come to a conclusion that is quite surprising, which is, okay, but the language of the discipline is nobody's mother tongue. So the thinking about language that goes with changing the language to a non-native language, so to a foreign language, is actually a thinking or a thought that we need to do always, even when we teach our students in their mother tongue, because the language of the disciplines is not the language that we use in the streets, and it's not the language that students will have learned at school necessarily. So it's something that we need to teach. So basically, by internationalization, through this internationalization and by putting language at the center, we suddenly realize that language should actually be at the center of teaching, of any kind of teaching. So I change the language of instruction, my teaching improves, the language is at the center, and I realize that I have to pay attention to literacy development, both in the mother tongue and in the foreign language. And this is actually quite crucial because it will allow, again, to make teaching better. We need to develop students' literacy and language skills, or communication skills, if you want, because this will help them to understand the content, understand my explanations, and so on. But it also allows students to think and analyze critically. If I don't have the tools of the language, then thinking becomes more difficult, analyzing becomes more difficult. I will not understand things like bias, objectivity, and so on, because all of these things are developed through language, or are realized through language. I also, or developing students' literacy also helps them to communicate or to learn to communicate skillfully in the disciplines. And we want our students to become experts in economics, in biology, and whatever not. And this also implies communicating skillfully in these disciplines. The other aspect that helps students, or in which we help students when we develop their language and literacy, is to communicate their emerging understandings. This is something that we all realize when we stop to think about it, because it normally goes unnoticed. But when we're trying to understand something, verbalizing it, putting it into words, is actually a very powerful tool. But of course, if I'm teaching through a language that is not my students' mother tongue, I need to give them the tools so that they can actually communicate these understandings. And remember that the language of the disciplines is nobody's mother tongue. So I need to give my students these tools to communicate even in their mother tongue. And finally, when we give these communication tools to our students, they are able to build on each other's ideas and co-construct knowledge. So they can listen to each other, they can express their understandings, they can build on each other's understandings, and so on. This is all very nice, you will say, but who does this? And this is the question I'm going to leave you with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this very interesting introduction, insight in the internalization of the classroom. I have to apologize because I was so eager to listen to our experts that I forgot to tell you that you can write all your questions in the chat, and both Anna and Garo will tackle them at the end of the session. And also, as you can see, the session is being recorded and it will be available on the EUGLOH YouTube channel. I have now the pleasure of introducing Garo Harwood. He has a really extensive international teaching experience, but since 2018, he has been a lecturer at the Academic Skills Service at Lund University, where he helps students acquire those skills that will make their academic life, that will help improve their academic life. And for the last 4 years, he has concentrated on intercultural skills for students. So, Garo, thank you very much. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lorena. I just wanted to correct something first. I'm not a professor. I'm a teacher at the school, but not an academic. So let me just talk a little bit about my background, and then I'll get on to the topic of my presentation. I'm just going to share my screen now. So I'm an educational developer and lecturer. So I was employed at the school to work at the academic skills services here at the business school at Lund University. But since that time, I've also taken more of an interest in internationalization. And I'm now a member of the International Council and a co-founder and head of the International Intercultural Competence Initiative here at LUCEM. So my background, so I've got about 26 years teaching experience at all levels of education, and I've been teaching in the UK, China, and Sweden. I've taught students in the past from over 60 nationalities. My family's bicultural, and I have a long-standing interest in cultural differences. So internationalization at LUCEM, we are a very international university. We have a large number of overseas teaching staff, and probably represents, according to the latest statistics, about 48 different nationalities. That includes non-teaching staff, technical administrative staff as well. We have 4 bachelor's programs, 2 of them in English, and 13 master's programs, which are all in English as well. And a large number of international program students are found in all of these courses. So we have a lot of overseas students. And each year, we send about 450 exchange students abroad each year, with about 400 coming in just to LUCEM. So there's a lot of international staff and students here at LUCEM. Now, one thing that perhaps we didn't expect when we started on the internationalization drive are some of the challenges that the students have. One of the challenges that we saw here at the Academic Skills Services, because we mainly offer support to students with their academic skills, but one thing that we saw was that there were a lot of students having disputes within various groups and teams, and also between thesis writing partners, because they write their theses often in pairs and sometimes in threes. And a lot of these disputes were within those mixed groups of local and overseas students. We also saw that there were a lot of students who were struggling with their courses and even failing courses because they didn't understand the teacher expectations. They didn't understand the importance of seminars and participation in seminars, the importance of critical analysis in their assignments, even the importance of citing sources and referencing correctly. And the third challenge for a lot of these overseas students was feeling homesick, feeling alienated, feeling that they weren't making any local friends, and often being in very much a bubble of people from their own countries. Now, looking at problems within these mixed teams first, I mean, there could be various reasons for that. Sometimes it was due to poor language skills. Sometimes there were personality clashes. Obviously, certain people lack motivation, perhaps, and a lot of people misunderstood the task or the topic. But we felt that some of these issues were related to a lack of intercultural awareness or intercultural competence. So we thought that it was important to do something about this. Now, there are lots of definitions of intercultural competence. This one is from Monash University, and it's one that I use with the students. Here, they state that the intercultural competence is this ability to function effectively across cultures, to think and act appropriately, and to communicate and work with people from different cultural backgrounds. And this includes internationalization at home or when they're overseas as well. And this word here, communicate, is the key that we thought. So what we decided to do is to start on these intercultural awareness workshops. And we started it with the 2 English language bachelor's programs, the IBU, the International Business Program, and the EOS, the Economy Society Program, which is related to economic history. And these have evolved over the last 4 years from something that was quite simple to something that is now much more in-depth and much more practical as well, I think. We use a mixture of theory and case studies. And the key outcome of these is that students should understand 3 things, basically, that people from different cultures have very different values. Their core values are very different, and that they think and act differently, and also that they communicate in very different ways. And a lack of understanding of these different values and in the way different people think and act, and especially communicate, can cause a lot of misunderstandings. One thing that we do, for example, is we give them examples of studies that have been done on different ways of communicating and how different cultures perceive things in different ways. There's this famous study done in 2008 where various US and Japanese undergraduates were asked whether the person in the center of the picture was happy or not. And the majority of both groups of students agreed that, in fact, he was. And then the picture was changed where the people in the background were looking sad rather than happy. And they were asked, do you think the person in the center is still happy? And the answer varied quite a lot between where the students came from. In fact, the majority of Japanese participants in the study, 72%, reported that their judgment of the central person's emotion were influenced by the background figures. So they reasoned that although the person was smiling, they couldn't really be happy because the people in the background were unhappy. The majority of American participants, also 72%, reported that, in fact, they didn't take into account the background figures at all, that their perception of the central figure was that he was still happy. This is just an example of some of the activities, some of the theoretical input that we have to show that, in fact, different people from different cultures have quite different core values. And one thing that we focus on particularly are these challenges in intercultural communication. Barner in 97 identified 6 what he calls stumbling blocks to intercultural communication. The first one was assuming similarities, assuming that the way people in different cultures, different countries think is the same. Of course, there's also language differences as well. Even if you're good at English, you may be missing some of the nuances of the language. The way you understand a non-native speaker and a native speaker can be quite different. Of course, you also have nonverbal misinterpretations, gestures, facial expressions, body language, and so on. And of course, we all come with various perceptions and stereotypes of people from different cultures as well, which can hinder our understanding of people from different backgrounds. The tendency to evaluate, the tendency to judge is something that can also be a stumbling block, as of course is anxiety in terms of understanding language and producing that language as well. One thing that we particularly focus on is this concept of direct versus indirect communication. Some cultures are very direct and say what they mean. Other cultures are much more indirect. And the emphasis there is very much on the listener to try to understand the meaning of the speaker. The meaning is not communicated directly. There's a lot more inference from nonverbal cues, for example. And also, different cultures have different levels of emotionality. You have emotionally restrained cultures where it's seen as more important to be calm and maintain this interpersonal harmony, and other ones where emotionally expressive cultures where using emotion is seen as much more authentic, and lack of emotion is seen as something that is decidedly inauthentic. So we end up with 4 different communication styles: this discussion, engagement, accommodation, and dynamic. And different discussion styles emphasize different points. A discussion style, for example, the direct and emotionally restrained discussion style emphasizes calmness and clarity. An engagement style puts much more emphasis on expressing one's feelings. An accommodation style is much more focused on finding alternative meanings to these ambiguous messages, at the same time as maintaining a very calm, emotionless style of communication. And a dynamic style using third parties to gather information and much more comfortable with strong emotional displays. And the problem is that different people from different communication styles can end up with very different ways of understanding each other. So, for example, if you're in the discussion style, for example, you may perceive yourself as having the best communication style, as being very calm and focused, also very logical, but other people might perceive you as being too logical, too unfeeling, and even uncomfortable with emotional displays. People in the discussion style looking at someone in the engagement style may see that they are even dominating and rude and uncomfortable with viewpoints disconnected from emotion. People in the engagement style looking at people in the accommodation style, for example, might perceive them as uncommitted and dishonest, and even having difficulty in voicing their own opinion. And people in the discussion style, for example, looking at people in the dynamic style, can see them as overly emotional and even tricky or devious because they're not being direct in the way they communicate. So we talk to the students about how having these different communication styles can end up causing a lot of confusion. The way you think you engage and the way other people think you engage can end up with very different perceptions. So what we do as well is we started these orientation workshops of students from overseas. We started with the exchange students, and we've now extended it to the program students. We give them practical advice on living and studying in Sweden. We also talk about the input on educational culture and academic expectations here at LUSM as well, especially in terms of reducing that culture shock. But one of the things that we emphasize is the learning culture here at Lund, the learning culture. And some students are coming from very, very different educational cultures, much more teacher-centered cultures, where a lot of things that we promote, seminars and so on like that, are either absent or very rarely used. So we talk about the fact it's a student-centered university where the teachers are a facilitator, where teachers are approachable, asking questions in classes encouraged, participation in seminars is expected, as is critical analysis as well, that it's not simply enough to repeat the information that you're reading. Plagiarism is a serious offense. That's something that surprised me when I started, that plagiarism and citing and referencing are seen in very, very different ways in different academic cultures. And a lot of students coming here are not aware of how important it is here at the university. Also, this idea of the expectation to work independently, as well as being able to cooperate effectively in the pairs and teams. This is something new for a lot of students as well. So it's important that we make this very explicit to the students. We also prepare them for outbound mobility as well, looking at culture-specific workshops based on their destination, again, focusing on the difference in values between Sweden and their destination country. And of course, it's an opportunity to meet others going to the same place as well. So very quickly to finish off, why is intercultural incompetence important at Lund? Well, we started this intercultural competence initiative, myself and my colleague Ulrika, as a joint initiative between the International Office and ASKS. We have members from lots of different departments. We try to raise awareness of intercultural competence through our websites and occasional pieces in the newsletter, sharing intercultural activities in the classroom. And we even try to encourage staff training as well, because it's a case not just of encouraging students or enabling students to gain more in terms of intercultural competence and intercultural awareness, but also the staff as well. The staff need to be aware of the challenges that the students face. We try to create more inclusive classrooms. We try to focus not simply on teaching foreign students how to fit into this Eurocentric way of academia, but also to try to understand what those foreign students and their different way of thinking can bring also to Lund as well. So rather than seeing it as a monocultural one-way process, we're trying to see it as a two-way process to leverage their viewpoints and their attitudes towards education. We also are trying to train students for the future. Intercultural competence has been identified as one of the top 10 work skills needed for the workforce. So this is something that we also emphasize. And the fact that there are various types of knowledge that students will need in the 21st century. The core content knowledge, even cross-disciplinary knowledge is only one aspect of it. We also need humanistic knowledge, the cultural competence side, and also the meta-knowledge in terms of communication as well. And of course, in a professional context and in even a community context as well, this concept of transcultural competence is regarded as important by both employers and as an aspect of the transnational civil society. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Garo. That was really interesting. I'm sure you have much more to say, but thank you for making it so concise and so interesting. There is indeed a question for you. Someone would like to know, what about students or staff who aren't interested in improving their intercultural skills or who don't see the importance of it? How do we reach or convince them?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I find that students are generally very enthusiastic. We've changed the workshop for one of the programs now to a whole 5-credit course, and we've just started it this year. And this was for all students, local and foreign. And as I say, there's been a lot of enthusiasm for that. I haven't seen the feedback yet, but the impression I got was that the people were sort of very keen on it, because it's something that I think a lot of people are naturally interested in anyway. Getting the staff on board can be a bit more tricky. Some of them see the value of it. Some of them aren't convinced of the centrality of it as well. So I've spent the last few months going around giving various lectures to staff and people at the university to try and sort of promote this idea. But I realize it's going to be a long process. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, indeed. And there's another tricky question that, I mean, the person asking, it says the first speaker, I think you could both maybe address it. Do you think internationalization is the future, or will countries go back to being more centered on themselves? And this person mentions there are some signs of that, for example, in the Netherlands, where they're limiting their educational offer in English. Do you think that's going to be a trend, perhaps, or?
Do you want to say something, Anna?
Okay, so it's difficult to know really if internationalization is going to be a trend. I think it is a trend already. And it's true that in the Netherlands, there are signs that they are going to pull back. I think that maybe they went too far. One of the problems, I mean, I have first-hand experience because one of my sons is actually studying in the Netherlands, and they have already told them that they are going to reduce the programs. I think one of the really big challenges, among other things, is accommodation, something very practical. With so many students, going to different countries, accommodation is starting to be a real problem. Other than that, I think at least as academic institutions, we have to collaborate. There is no way around it. I mean, we are international. When you ask for funding, it has to be international. So, I mean, I don't think that there's a way around it. The other problem, or the other question, or something different, would be to limit the mobility, students' mobility. From our perspective at Alcalá, when I speak to my students, they always say that the year that they have spent abroad, or the semester they spent abroad, is probably the greatest learning experience they've ever had. Often they don't study very much, but just the fact that they are in a different country, in a different context, and as Garo was saying, in a different cultural context, learning context, and so on, is so important for their development that I don't think that we should turn our backs on internationalization.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with Anna on that. The students here, as one of the big things about LUSEM is the number of students that we send abroad each year in exchange. But I think everyone benefits. I think overseas students benefit a lot from coming to London. I think the local students benefit in an enormous way from interacting with people from different cultural backgrounds. And I think internationalization is inevitable. I mean, it's not just the Netherlands, Denmark as well has embarked recently on trying to cut the number of English language courses because they argue the amount of money they spend on it and the number that actually stay in the country afterwards is not justified. But these students inevitably are going to go on to have an international career, whether they live abroad or not. They're going to be working for international companies. They're going to have international colleagues, international clients. It seems extremely counterproductive to limit that because this is the future for the students. The world is becoming more connected despite various nationalist leaders that are trying to hold it back. But I don't think these are just stumbling blocks on the path, but I don't think you can turn back the tide.
Yeah, Andrea in the audience was also mentioning housing as being one of the main problems in the Netherlands. Yeah, of course, if we cannot host and accommodate all students coming, then we have a problem. There's also another question, and I wanted to ask you also, how can we train staff? Are we able to, can we train teachers, lecturers? Can we train administrative staff to be a bit more intercultural? And also, can we train them linguistically to be able to have a session, to have a lecture in English in a language that is not their own? Are there training opportunities for staff and more specifically for teaching staff, for faculty members? It's a question addressed to both of you, and also in relation to a question in the chat that says, could professors be more informed and maybe more accommodating to cultural differences, perhaps?
I'll talk about the cultural side, and then maybe Anna can talk about the linguistic side. But in terms of intercultural training for staff members, absolutely. We've had a couple of our professors already go on this training organized by a company that organizes training courses around Europe. There are in fact quite a lot of different organizations that provide training. Some of them will actually come to your university as well to provide training en bloc if that's what they want. But there are certainly opportunities, and I've been trying to promote it for the last few months as well. I think it's extremely important that staff get on board with this, because it's not simply enough for me to go into various programs, the various interventions and talk about this, but this needs to be built into the general competency of all staff at the university, I think, because most teachers are dealing with overseas students on a day-to-day basis. And, overseas students are coming to London unaware of the expectations of the educational culture and often having problems because of that lack of awareness. But teachers, I think, also have a responsibility to be aware of the problems that the students are facing so they can meet each other halfway. So I think it is important. The money's there. It's just a question of the will, really.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to the intercultural that Garo has explained so well. I think another area where sometimes problems occur is when you have mixed teams for research, for example, for research projects. Sometimes people just don't communicate in the same way, and the expectations are not the same of the kind of work that we want to do. So again, I think that the intercultural aspect is really, really important, and we can't take it for granted that everybody will understand, even though, you know, you're lecturers and you're supposed to have an education. So I think that's very important. As far as training the lecturers is concerned, at Alcalá we have a training program now put in place for people who want to offer their courses in English, both for national students and for international students. Some years ago, it was limited to learning the language, learning English or improving your English, which is clearly not enough because, as I tried to explain, teaching in a foreign language is actually teaching in a different way, or has to have a kind of a different approach to teaching. More learner-centered, as you mentioned, like, you know, meeting the students' needs or taking it more into account. So I think there are, I mean, I know there are, because we do have one. And in Spanish universities, there are other examples where lecturers are being trained. I'm not sure how it works in other European countries where maybe the English level is higher and therefore it's taken for granted that lecturers are able to teach in a foreign language, but maybe the people listening to us can tell us how it works in their universities.
Perhaps, yeah. Maybe we can let the people in the audience, I don't know, if write in their own experiences, or feel free, please. I will proceed with another question. Someone would like to know what is step 2? Like they say, understanding yourself and the people around you seem to be step 1, but what's next? If students have established their discussion styles, engagement styles, and so on, how do they move on from that and establish a successful way to communicate, for example, in a group work, in teamwork?
Yeah, I mean, this is the tricky bit. This is the difference between intercultural awareness and intercultural competence. There is a sort of sliding scale. We actually use a measurement tool called the IDI to measure students' progress on this. We've just started as a pilot project. In fact, there are lots of different measures out there where students can take questionnaires and get a score on a continuum, for example. But the intercultural awareness, moving on from that, being aware of it, to actually being able to successfully navigate different communication styles and communication from cultures which are often diametrically opposed in terms of, you know, a direct and indirect communication culture, is quite tricky. The key thing, though, I mean, all we can do really at this stage is just raise their awareness of the differences and let them know that, for example, I mean, we have had issues in the past with mixed teams where, say, the Swedish students will claim that the overseas students are not being effective partners. And then the overseas students, when we speak to them, say that they're being excluded from the team. And often it's all it comes down to is the fact that they have different communication styles, but they're not aware of those differences. And they end up suddenly becoming very judgmental and excluding. And there's a sort of breakdown of communication, really. So what we're trying to do is say, you know, don't rush to judgment. I mean, there can be a lot of reasons why someone is not necessarily talking up during group work. There can be a lot of reasons. I mean, maybe from the quieter students' perspective, the people are being quite sort of dominating and rude. They think they're just being, you know, expressive. Other people think they're being a bit more controlling, in the same way that more direct cultures can perceive students from more indirect cultures as being very reticent. And maybe they're not being reticent. They're just trying to reflect a little bit more on it. Maybe they're from cultures that don't want to disturb that group harmony as well. So there can be a lot of reasons. We just want to make them aware that there are lots of different reasons, not to rush to judgment, and just to be more open and ask each other, you know, what do you think, and how do you perceive this, and what role do you want to take? You know, just being very, very clear about it rather than rushing to judgment. That's all we can do at the moment. I mean, the development of competence can take a while, and with bachelor students, perhaps we have the opportunity to do that. With master students only here for a year, it's obviously a little bit more challenging. But if we start early, right at the start of the bachelor's program, and they're working, and we deliberately manipulate the teams as well, so we make sure that they're in mixed groups as much as possible, that these groups change every course. And hopefully by the end of those 3 years, they've pretty much worked with everyone else, and they've developed an ability to understand and to empathize. So it's a development of empathy that we're really after. That hopefully the skills will come, but I mean, that's a very long-term project. Yeah.
Thank you, Carol. There's also a question in the audience. What can we do as international students to improve our relationship with the locals? I mean, we can, like, it comes from plays both ways. I mean, it's just like it works both ways, that we, like, as an international student, you can also make an effort, you know? I don't know if you both have a...
Do you have any thoughts on that, Anna?
Well, I have a little battle with my son because he's not learning Dutch, and I'm telling him to learn some Dutch because he can't expect everybody to know English, for example. So I think that, you know, go out of your way a little bit to just, you know, to meet the host culture, I think is something important. I know that international students have a difficult time sometimes, especially if they are mixed with national students, because it's easier to work with other people who are in your same situation than with the nationals who also have their friends and everything. But, you know, just try to be open to other people and try to be open to the new culture and to the situation at home. I mean, in the host country rather than at home. That's what I would say, but you're the specialist, Garo, so go ahead.
I'm not a specialist, but no, I agree with that. I mean, it's very easy to stay in our silos. That's our natural tendency. Swedish students stay with other Swedish students. I mean, even within our school, we have those from Stockholm staying together, those from Gothenburg staying together. So, I mean, even here we have students staying in the silos. And of course, it's natural for overseas students to do as well. In fact, it's probably a little easier for those overseas students who come from countries where there are very few students coming, say from Mongolia, compared to, say, those from China, where we have a lot of students, because there is then less opportunity for them to mix with their own sort of ethnic, national, linguistic group. And in some way, they're sort of forced to make friends outside. But even within that, what normally happens is they tend to make friends with other foreign students as opposed to home students. And the problem sort of lies on both sides, really. You know, maybe home students are not always open to meeting foreign students. Foreign students don't really want to leave that comfort zone either. It's very hard to sort of break out of that. We're working with the Lund University or the Lusam Student Union to try to encourage more activities where the local and foreign students can work together, can mix, can do activities together. It would be nice. We don't have a lot of sports going on actually here at the university. Having some more sports teams where local and foreign students are able to participate would be a big help as well, I think. But you need some structures in place to facilitate that, really. It's not going to happen naturally.
I don't know, Anna, if you want to add anything else? I think sport is always
I agree. Sport
tool.
is a very good,
you
know, it's a very good place to make contact.
There's another aspect mentioned in the Q&A, academic language. How do we deal with academic language? I mean, this person says that in the US, academic language should be taught regardless of the mother tongue. What may be some of the reasons why such ideas and corresponding methodologies, I'm trying to summarize the question, so I hope you understand it, seem not to be commonplace for those teaching in higher education? How strong and active do you see researchers of learning and instruction in higher education at your respective universities?
Um,
I don't know, Anna.
Okay, this is a tough one. I know that in the US, this has been in place for ages, with varying results, with varying success. But I think that the main problem is the fact that we are not aware of language. I mean, we just take it for granted and we use it, but we are not able to think, or we don't think very much about it. And when you're a specialist in, say, economics, you don't feel that you have to teach language. So I think that, I mean, it's the two things. I think it's just the fact that we're not aware of language. Jeff Tweers, who's a US specialist in academic language, says that it's like asking a fish to describe water when you ask an academic to describe academic language. We don't know. It's just there, right? We use it. But it definitely, I think we definitely need to encourage some kind of reflection and awareness in all teaching staff in relation to language, because as I said, nobody reaches university being an economist or speaking like an economist or speaking like a biologist. And the speaking also is related to the thinking. So it's not just the language as such, or not just terminology that we need. It's actually the way that we think about processes and the way that we put it into words. So basically, I think it's language awareness, and also the fact that many people think it's just not their duty. This should be, language professors should teach language and not specialists in other disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's a lot of the teachers here at LUS assume that the students are coming with a certain level of language, and that their language is therefore sufficient to access all the courses and the various lectures. And for most of the students it's true, but for some of the students it's not true. And there is an idea, well, if these students don't have the requisite level of English or the specialist vocabulary, then they're going to have to deal with that. And so it sort of falls onto us here at the Academic Skills Service to support those students. But it's not really an ideal situation, because a lot of the time they do feel excluded from the lectures because they don't have those language skills. But I mean, again, that's not really the professor's problem, in a sense, because maybe we should tighten up our admissions procedures. I mean, that might be one aspect of it, but in a way, all teachers, on the other hand, I would say all teachers are language teachers as well. So we all need to make accommodation for students with different strengths in speaking and listening. Yeah.
That's indeed very true, that all teachers should be at least language teachers. I think so too. There's another question for you, Garo, or perhaps more a request. Do you have criteria or survey questions that can be used to evaluate individual students' communication style in terms of directness or emotion? And maybe more generally, from the perspective of the teacher, how can one evaluate, how can one assess intercultural skills?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of sort of communication styles, we just ask the students to self-evaluate. I mean, on the whole, they're pretty good at placing themselves on the grid at some point. I mean, a lot of them are not exactly in the center of a particular square. They're the boundaries. They're more towards one than the other. It also depends on different situations as well, because the way they are with family and friends might be different from the way they are at work, for example, as well. So the context is also important. But there isn't a scale that I know of to look at directness and indirectness. What we do is we relate it to different cultures. We say that certain cultures are more likely to be direct than others, and there are out there are lots of scales for measuring that. There is also a lot of different frameworks that you can use to assess it, but it tends to be looking at countries as an aggregate rather than as an individual. The only thing we use on an individual level is this IDI, this Intercultural Development Inventory, but that looks at general levels of interculturality and intercultural development. It's not looking specifically at communication styles. Yeah.
Thank you. There's also another question. Are your universities promoting that students join any experiences out of Europe? I think all universities I don't know if you'll agree, but I think all universities within the alliance, the EUGLOH alliance, promote any international experience. I mean, let it be in Europe or further beyond, but I suppose you agree that we're all trying to make them more international, our students.
Anna, did you want to say something?
Yeah, okay. Definitely at Alcalá, we have programs going to the US and I don't know, China, many countries. And also,
Everywhere.
of course, in Spain, we have the South American side, which is very easy for us because we share the same language.
Yeah, that's one difference, I guess, with LUCEM. I mean, there's a lot of students go to Europe. Outside of Europe, quite a few go to North America, Australia, a few go to New Zealand, but we also have quite a lot going to Asia as well, Korea, China, Japan, a lot going to Singapore and Hong Kong. But as far as I know, very few, Ulrika can correct me on this one, but very few going to South America. So it's a slightly different emphasis. But I mean, the students are very keen to try something more long distance, whether it's some Anglophone country or non-Anglophone country. But it's a fantastic experience for them, and most of them come back extremely happy with their semester abroad.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a last comment from Paloma Rodriguez. In my opinion, I think that internationalization courses should be mandatory for teachers because there will always be foreign students in class or in many occasions, and we must always empathize and respect other cultures. So that's thumbs up for you both with the work you're doing and your research to try to make our classrooms more respectful. I don't know if you want to comment on that. It's like,
yeah, I mean, it's a quite case of sort of respect for one thing. It's also a case that, we're inviting these students from other countries to come to our university. We have to do our very best to make them feel included and to make them succeed in their studies as well. It's not acceptable for them to come and fail the courses because they don't understand expectations, to be unhappy because they're unable to work in groups, to feel alienated from the student culture. We have to do our very best to make them feel happy and to succeed. But beyond that, there's also a question of what they can bring as well. It's not a case of helping them to fit in. They have their own experiences, their own perspectives that our local students could really benefit from. And I think that, it's a two-way process, and it's a win-win process if handled effectively. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think that we need to look at this from the positive, as you say, as a win-win. There are lots of potential advantages of having international students or migrant students, which I think Paloma is making reference to in our classes, because Garo just mentioned making the expectations that we have. And often as lecturers, we are not even aware of the expectations that we have. And the moment that there is a clash, we suddenly become aware of what we're actually expecting, and we can make it more explicit. And this will benefit both the nationals and the international students. So I think there is the potential for growth as a lecturer as well. And I think Paloma is quite right. We cannot assume anymore that we will only have Spanish students or only Swedish students in our classes. This is just not the world we live in. We live in a world with lots of migration, and we do need to accommodate students from different cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, I absolutely agree on that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where perhaps the prefix trans, not that you were mentioning one of your last slides, comes in, not to find the third space where there's respect for one another. There's time for a very last question. Are there any cross-disciplinary collaborations that you believe could enhance research efforts in understanding the outcomes of internationalization, particularly in relation to language?
I'll let Anna answer that.
I'm struggling.
I don't know if we have time for such that would be a long response, maybe, but maybe you can say a few words to answer at the rhyme.
Okay, so I think what I've been talking about is basically a process that I've been observing not only in higher education but also in primary and secondary education, and it's called CLIL. I mean, this way of teaching where you teach a subject, any subject basically, through a foreign language. This is a research field that is very large in language education. So lots of research is going on in, you know, primary, secondary, higher education to do with language. And this is not necessarily related to internationalization as such. It is in universities, but not in primary and secondary education. Yeah, definitely there is a lot of research. If you're interested in higher education, you should look for EMI, which is English medium instruction, which is like because, I mean, like it or not, English is the lingua franca for this. So there is lots of research on the effects of EMI in higher education. If you want to look more broadly, then you can look for CLIL as the acronym for Content and Language Integrated Learning, and also the learning outcomes, I mean, in terms of language and so on. There is lots of research in this area.
Thank you very much, Anna. Well, I would like to thank you, both of you again, Anna, Garo, and all the people attending this session today. And we will continue with the Spotlight on Education next year, which sounds very far away, but it's only a few weeks from today. Thank you very much and have a lovely evening. Bye.
Thank you, Lorena.